So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series, Smarter Together. Today's webinar is the third in this new series, hosted by Georgia Tech's Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation team. My name is Greg McCormick. I'm the director of the Georgia Smart Communities Challenge, a grant program offered through the Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation Group. The grant is available to local governments in Georgia and provides funding and a partnership with a Georgia Tech researcher to execute a year-long study or pilot program of smart community technology. Interested communities can visit our website or email us. Both are provided in the chat area of today's webinar for your reference. Before we get started in today's webinar, a few housekeeping reminders. Please keep your audio and video muted throughout the presentation to limit interruptions. Please utilize the chat area to submit your questions. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, and you can submit those questions at any time. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll make the slides available on our website as well as the recording. They'll be available in the media area of our events tab, and that link has also been made available in the chat area. So again, welcome to the Smarter Together webinar series, and I'd now like to introduce Deborah Lamb, Managing Director of Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation, to welcome you and introduce today's presenter. Welcome, Deborah.
Thanks, Greg. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see everyone again virtually. This has become a really popular time for us to gather. We've started these webinar series first in the first Thursday of May, and we basically have a full lineup of webinars every Thursday at noon. And the point of these webinars is really what the title says, which is to really bring inspirational research for community impact. And really engage with our wider community and showcase how Georgia Tech research can really facilitate some of these broader issues around communities, both in but also the broader physical infrastructure around the built environment. So this is our third webinar series, and I'm delighted to have Cliff talk a little bit about, economic development and real estate in this new state, and then have Daniela Perry from the Georgia Chamber moderate this discussion. As Greg noted, some housekeeping just to make sure that if you have any questions, please put it on your chat box. Daniela and I and the rest of the team will be monitoring the chat box, as well as the presentation slides, and this webinar will be recorded at the end. So you'll have access to the slides and to this recording if you should miss anything. But without further ado, I know Cliff has had some issues with is Cliff on right now? Nope, not yet, I think. So Cliff has had some issues with his login. So once he joins back on, he will be able to start the presentation. And the idea is that once he finishes his presentation, then Daniela will moderate the series of questions. Just a little bit of the backdrop of this and why we decided to choose this topic. We had our first webinar around smart and wearable devices for first responders that Professor Yao did. Our second webinar that happened last Thursday was on rural transit in Georgia. And this webinar is around real estate and economic development in a post during COVID-19 era. And the idea about this is with Cliff, and now he's back on. Cliff, can you hear us now? Cliff, I think you're on mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right.
Can you show your screen?
Sure can. Give me just a second.
Perfect. And then, of course, while Cliff is uploading his screen, is really to help us set the scene in terms of how to manage real estate and what are the broader considerations in the market given our newer state of normal around COVID-19. So without further ado, I'm going to let Cliff start the presentation. Thank you so much, Cliff.
Sure. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate your time, and I'll be respectful of your time. As we go through here, I will be talking about economic development trends that I'm seeing in the marketplace as well as in real estate. These opinions are mine. They are not necessarily those of the Georgia Institute of Technology. And if you would do me a favor, my family and I have had an aunt and an uncle die in the last 2 months. Our uncle passed last night, and so if you would do me a favor and let's offer them a moment of silence and lift them up. Thank you very much. So today, I'm going to be talking about COVID-19 and what I expect is going to happen here in the coming months and years. COVID-19 is truly one of those events that we can call as a truly exogenous event, meaning that we didn't have a lot of time to prepare for it, and it has affected multiple markets. It's affected supply. It's affected demand. In particular, it has affected goods that need social interaction to be produced or consumed. COVID-19 has implications for economic development. I'll start there, and then I will move on to implications for the various asset classes underneath the umbrella of real estate. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we're learning and adapting to COVID-19 pressures and how that learning and adaptation process will continue for years to come. And then I'm going to end, and I'll have positive notes throughout. I know a lot of people like to focus on how negative this has been, but there are some great opportunities that are presenting itself as a result of this, and I'll spend some time talking about those toward the end of the presentation. So let me start by talking about where we are today. And where we are today is that the BEA, which ironically is one of my former employers up in Washington, D.C., reported to us recently that real gross domestic product, or real GDP, fell at an annualized rate of 4.8% in the first quarter. Now, it's important for you to know that that is what they call an advanced estimate. The BEA comes out with 3 different estimates. They come out with an advanced estimate, I believe, within about a month of the end of a quarter, and then they will do a revised estimate here in about another month, and then there will be a final estimate that comes out sometime after that, I believe another month. And so what's important to know is that the advanced estimate is just one, what we call a data vintage, and there will be subsequent revisions to that 4.8% number. I've seen that number go up in the revisions. I've seen that number go down in the revisions. And at this point, we really don't know what the direction of magnitude or the direction of impact is going to be on that 4.8 when the advanced estimate is revised. But needless to say, that's a big number. April 2020 U.S. unemployment is at 14%. Jerome Powell, who's chairman of the Federal Reserve, on 60 Minutes the other night, said that his economists at the Fed are reporting to him to that number by the end of quarter 2 of this year could be as high as 25 to 30%. So it's affecting all of us in some way. You can't impact 25 or 30%. You can't have 25 to 30% unemployment without everybody really knowing somebody who's been affected by this. This affected my family as well. Recent evidence suggests that 39% of households that have an annual income below $40,000 a year lost work since March of 2020. So again, this seems to have some disparate impacts on those at the lower end of the income spectrum. Home sales are starting to decline, but this is an important concept that I don't think has gotten as much traction in the media as it should. But home sales are declining, but prices are what we call sticky downward. And basically what that means is that the count of transactions will start to fall before prices will fall. They're sticky in the downward direction is what that means. And that occurs with things as disparate as environmental contamination events that impact real estate markets, as well as we're seeing here with the current pandemic. And the same thing also happened after the financial crisis in the late 2000s. First American, which is a property data firm out in, they've got offices all over the place, but I think they're headquartered in California. They forecast that prices will slow down but not turn negative. And then you've got Zillow forecasting that sales could drop as much as 60% in the spring due to all of our stay-at-home orders. But this is important. Prices in their forecast will only drop on average 3 to 4% through 2021. So again, you may see evidence of sales transactions counts coming down, but they're forecasting that prices would only drop on average 3 to 4% through 2021. Now, obviously, there's going to be individual counties throughout the country where that's greater, and there will be some that maybe aren't impacted that much at all. But on average, they're forecasting 3 to 4% through 2021. The other thing that's really happening that's interesting is that before COVID-19, large companies in particular were stockpiling cash. We call that dry powder. And these companies were taking this dry powder and they were putting it to the side in anticipation of a recession. What they did not anticipate, though, is that this impact, the COVID-19 impact, would be so hard and so fast. But there were a lot of companies that were anticipating a recession. They just simply did not know that COVID-19 would be the immediate cause of that recession. Businesses are stress testing their financial forecasts. One Fortune 500 CEO told me recently, this is maybe about a month ago now, told me that in 2008, his firm experienced a 15 to 18% revenue drop as a result of the financial crisis. This time around, his worst case scenario is a 30% revenue drop. And you can imagine for a Fortune 500 company, that's a big number. But again, when you're talking about worst case scenarios, it's important to talk about what is possible, but maybe not as probable. So that's an important distinction, probability versus possibility. His firm is really looking at, worst case scenarios in the 30% range, but his best case scenarios, given that it's in the logistics industry, would be, just a couple of percentage points of impact in his best case scenarios. Deals are being delayed or are not being consummating at all. And a lot of deals we're seeing price and term renegotiations. They're actually quite common. And in some of my other outside of Georgia Tech work with family offices, I'm seeing a lot of price and term renegotiations, which I'll allude to now. So this is the first slide that's talking about some of my economic development implications of COVID-19 and what we're going to see in the short term, and then a little bit of what I expect to see in the long term. As I just alluded to, deal terms are changing, and it was pretty immediate. The biggest one that I saw talking to a lot of family offices was that these what we call due diligence periods were typically, and you've been through this, if you own a home, you've been through a due diligence period. It's that period between the time you sign that sales contract to buy a home and when you actually close on it. That's the due diligence period that I'm referring to. So if you bought a home on the residential side, typically that's anywhere between 25 and 35 days. In the commercial world, we typically see, and when businesses get sold, we typically see 60-day due diligence periods. We're seeing those 60-day periods turn into 120 to 150-day diligence periods. So we're seeing acquisition firms taking a lot more time, making sure that this is really the deal they want to go through with, particularly because now they're having to stress test their financial scenarios in a way that they weren't before. It'd be very easy to imagine if you're trying to acquire a hotel for, let's say, $95 million in some place like Seattle. You can imagine that that number is probably going to change now, given that the hotel is basically closed, or seeing 5 to 20% occupancy maybe at best. So you can imagine that a lot of additional testing is having to be done behind the scenes to see how you make ends meet for your ultimate investors. What I'm also starting to see is that, what I think we'll see is that supply chains that have exposure to China are going to leave and invest elsewhere. I also expect to see that with our current spike in unemployment, I think that rehiring is going to be slow and methodical. You hear a lot of people talk about these V-shaped recoveries. I really don't think it. Having been a small business owner at one time, we had 60 employees and almost 8-digit revenue. Having been there and having been through that process of having to lay people off, I think the rehiring is going to be slow. I think it's going to be methodical. I think there's going to be a lot more attention paid to remote and flexible work options, being able to live pretty much wherever you want, but being able to do the job. I have some more to say about that later. But that 38 million unemployment number, that is the update as of this morning. As you know, every Thursday, initial unemployment claims come out. And since mid-March, we've now lost, or I guess a more accurate way to say it is that 38 million initial unemployment claims have been filed since mid-March. The other thing I expect to see is that I think you're going to see a large infrastructure bill come out in the next 6 to 12 months from Congress. And, maybe a little pessimistically, I don't think it's only the prop of employment. I really think that it's also an attempt of the president to improve his reelection chances. He and his staff have to be paying attention to history. History suggests that when we have a good economy, that incumbents do really well in those elections. And I think putting people back to work, maybe some kind of New Deal type infrastructure bill will come through in the next 6 to 12 months, but it's got to be discussed for it to impact voters' decisions. And then the last point in this slide that I'll make is that internet bandwidth is going to continue to increase to accommodate this new world or this enhanced world of telecommuting that I think we're going to see. I think you're going to see people working either close at home or closer to home. Me personally, I'm actually one of those who don't work at home. I work closer to home. I actually have an office that's about 10 minutes from my home, in addition to my one in Atlanta. And I'm one of those that works closer to home when I can, just because we have 5 children and it's noisy. On this slide, I wanted to piggyback just a little bit on the fiber capacity thing. I got this map from submarinecablemap.com, and the reason, first of all, I like maps, and second of all, I think it's interesting to see all the different fiber connections that we have throughout the world. I did my best to put the entire world on there, but I cut off a little bit of Asia and Australia. But what you can see here and what's been reported is that on these major routes, fiber capacity has actually been increasing 32% annually over the last 4 years, or at least the 2013 to 2017 period that's been reported. And, with that additional connectivity, it makes perfect sense, or it's a great foundation for telecommuting to increase, especially if you have multinational corporations. Okay, move on to the next slide. These are other economic development implications that I'm starting to see due to COVID. I spoke earlier in the week to Conway. If you're not familiar with Conway, they publish Site Selection Magazine. They're in Atlanta. And I got some really good information from them. Basically what they told me is that it's a little too early yet to tell if economic development prospect activity has changed. What they did point me to, though, is some good news. And these are outside the state of Georgia, but they're important nonetheless. Taiwan Semiconductor has just announced a $12 billion project, that is 12 billion with a B, in Arizona, and it's going to create 1,600 new advanced manufacturing jobs. And from what I have been told, I have not verified this, but from what I've been told, that might be the largest economic development project that Arizona's ever landed. Like I said, I did not independently confirm that, but it's certainly one of the biggest. The other thing is that related to economic development is what's going to happen to state budget allocations. And as some of you probably know, various state agencies, including the University System of Georgia, have been asked to reduce its budget by 14%. And if you just look, those are big numbers. I mean, if you look at Georgia Tech, for example, and these are rough numbers, but roughly 1/3 of Georgia Tech's budget is state appropriations. If you take 14% of that number, you're talking about $45 to $46 million. That's a lot of money to cut in a short period of time due to these expected state revenue shortfalls. And as they continue to occur, what's going to happen to the various tax incentives that are being offered by the state? What's going to happen to economic development organizations or EDOs? Maybe there's a possibility that some EDOs will be on the chopping block. I've been informed that that's happened in Florida over the last couple of years, multiple times by the state legislature down there, in putting, I forget the name, maybe Enterprise Florida is the one that was on the chopping block a couple of times. Again, I don't know what the thinking is there. This is kind of secondhand from the folks at Conway, but I think it's interesting to think about what that new budget dedicated to economic development is going to look like, and then what does the allocation look like inside that pie, that economic development pie, so to speak. Are we as aggressive with tax incentives in the future, or or do we try to, stay the course and maybe cut back a little bit? So not only are states facing a crisis in terms of economic development and revenue shortfalls, but companies are cutting back as well on their economic development budgets. One example I've seen recently, Societe Generale, which is a French bank, is cutting its corporate travel by 80%. They're going to what they call it only essential travel. Companies are also hoarding cash and not spending as much or allocating as much toward their economic development budgets, and that's particularly the case if companies looking to locate to the U.S. were going to construct new office buildings. So there's one of the issues here that when I get to the real estate, I'm going to preview for a second one of the issues I'm going to get to when I talk about real estate, is that with such a change and what we think is going to be a change in demand for office, it wouldn't make sense for a new company coming to the U.S. to build a new office if there's plenty of supply already on the market that can be rehabbed to meet their needs. And so if companies are allocating capital to new office construction, we are starting to see a pullback in that particular use of funds. And again, once we get some prospect activity data from Conway at the end of, let's say, July, then we'll be able to really put some numbers on that. Related to that, as part of the site selection process, cost efficiencies are going to become really important. And there also, I think, will be a focus on decreasing the cost side of income statements, not only the search process. The one thing I want to leave you with on this slide is you're very aware of the shift to online courses, whether you've got a kid in elementary school, high school, or even college kids. So if you're shifting to online courses, I'm starting to wonder how this affects businesses wanting to locate to Georgia. And is it a different kind of brain drain? Typically, when we think of brain drain, we think of educating folks in the state, and then those students leave the state. That's the typical definition of brain drain. So do you call it brain drain if the kids never come to the state of Georgia in the first place? If they participate through online courses and they're physically here, is that a different kind of brain drain? So I just want to kind of leave you with that question before we move on to the next line, is something to ponder. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to connect this discussion of economic development to real estate. And I do this really for people who may not have as much of a background in these two or in one or the other topic. It's a very straightforward connection of the two. It really depends on your role in the transaction. So if you're in economic development in some way, whether it's site selection or something else, you will be involved in the transaction at some point, whether it's pre-development, whether you're, the folks over at Williams, Scott Pogue and his group, if you do site and engineering analysis, if you do financing, if you're on the construction and marketing side toward the end of the project, or if you're the on-site property manager or the operator, and you're concerned about keeping building occupancy numbers up and making sure that folks pay their rent. So depending on where you are in the transaction, you have a connection to both real estate and to economic development. On the individual side, you do as well. There are real estate implications of where you choose to live, where you choose to work, dine, recreate, worship, travel, and it seems obvious, but where you choose to live and where you choose to work simultaneously determines your commute. I think there's going to be some interesting travel differences, some interesting commute differences that come out of this as people contemplate not going into the office 5 days a week. Maybe they will have staggered work schedules, overlapping hours. If you're in multiple time zones and those kinds of things, that's certainly, we can sit here and theorize about what that might look like, but until people figure out how to the degree that they feel safe in their work environments and shielded, I guess, is one way to think of it from maybe the terms of others. I don't think that's really going to play out until you start to see how people react when they get back to the workplace. At this point, I want to transition to talking about real estate implications of COVID, and I want to start with the office sector. So companies need to recognize this tension between work from home and the call for more office space due to physical distancing. And I use that term, physical distancing. I don't like the term social distancing because social can mean so much more than just being 6 feet away from someone. So I use the term physical distancing. But there is a tension between folks who are calling more for work from home and the work from home experiment that we've been going through, and the call for more office space. JLL put out a survey last month where they surveyed folks that are in their buildings and the ones that they manage on kind of the brokerage side, the tenant management side. And so prior to COVID, how many days did you work from home? They were surveying folks. And you can see the allocation here in the pie chart on the left. You've got most folks working either 0 or 1 day per week from home. And then look at the one on the right, and the question is different, right? How many days would you like to work from home? Was this generally deemed safe to return to normal work activities? And the allocation changes quite a bit. 3 or more days per week increases a decent amount. 2 to 3 days a week increases a lot. 1 to 2 days per week, shrinks, and then you've got 0 days per week. And what that tells us is that people are really taking this work from home thing seriously. They're generally, and I'll show you this on the next slide. Generally coming into the office meant informally collaborating with people that you work with, attending scheduled meetings, and the perception that the role that you had was office-based. Well, that's changing, that perception of what it means to come into the office. And what you've got here, again, from the JLL survey, is that people go into the office to collaborate and socialize, but virtual gatherings can help us kind of close this gap. So what does that mean? Well, that means that people feel like they're being equally productive at home for the most part. In that same survey, you can see the number of respondents that thought that they were either as productive or more productive at home than they were at work. And then on the right-hand side, you can see how they evaluate your work from home arrangements. Some people said that it's not great, don't have the basic requirements they need. I spoke to somebody yesterday who actually went back to their office and got all of their monitors. So now they have 3 monitors at home, and they feel like they're so much more productive with the multiple monitors and things like that. So there are some people who are slowly adjusting to this and figuring out that they can be nearly as equally productive, and if not more so, at home than they were in the office. Now, this is tongue-in-cheek, so bear with me here, but is this the office of the future? And yes, this woman is in jail, and yes, this is somebody, maybe her lawyer, talking to her, but you can see the glass in between. You can see they've got telephones, old style, which would have to be sanitized after every use, and you can see that with the glass in the middle, what I think we're going to start to see is a removal from or a backtracking from this open office environment. And this open concept I think is going to change back to maybe something like glass walls, where you can still see people and you can still, communicate using, facial affect and whatnot without, your typical wall. But I think there's going to be a move back to kind of the glass wall environment from this open concept floor plan that's been kind of the trend for the last 15 to 20 years, I guess. Currently with hotel occupancy rates in the 5 to 20% range here in North America, I think that hotel financing is going to slow down. I use the word freeze. That may be a little too strong of a word, but we are definitely going to start to see workouts increase. And I don't mean in the gym. I mean workouts where you have, debt. You've got to either refinance that debt, or you file bankruptcy, and then you have to go to somebody like Glass-Ratner. Then you have to have a workout done, which is you put your debtors on the schedule, you refinance the capital structure of the firm, and then you continue on with business as usual. I think large conferences are going to retool. We've seen a bunch of this already, but there's two pieces here. There's large conferences retooling, but then there's also budgets that can't support travel. So I've already given you the example of Societe Generale that has cut its corporate travel budget by 80%. We haven't even talked about universities and colleges yet and what's going to happen to those budgets. Some people would think that the travel budget may be, for professors or researchers, may be one of the easiest things to cut. I don't know how that's going to pan out, but I've got to think that as large conferences go virtual, that there's going to be an impact here on universities as well. I can tell you that this year, all of my conferences have been canceled that I usually attend. I've already attended 2 that I would normally attend in person online, and they've worked out great. Is that going to be the standard going forward? I don't think so. People still like to have that physical and then social interaction with colleagues, especially folks in the same industry or in the same area of research. But I could see with all the Zoom and WebEx calls I've been on for the last couple of months here, a lot of these conferences may go to an in-person, in-virtual option as they move forward. I think restaurants are going to evolve with what we call cloud kitchens. If you're not familiar with cloud kitchens, these are the commercial-grade kitchens that exist that handle food orders from multiple restaurants. It's a cost saving to a restaurant because they don't have the kitchen capacity inside their physical location, but it would be nearby. These are pretty popular, as you can imagine, in places like New York City and your larger metropolitan areas. And then, as we've already seen, curbside pickup is picking up tremendously. I've used it. I know a lot of you have as well. I want to move just real quickly and say one thing about industrial real estate, and it really is the perfect storm for industrial real estate right now. You've got all of your e-commerce firms. You've got same-day delivery. You've got a little bit of shrinking urban infill warehouse space, which means that warehouse space is located outside the urban central business district. It's a little bit under the radar, I think, of most institutional investors. And, those companies right now are doing really well. You think about how many packages you've had shipped to your home over the last couple of months, compare that to a year ago, and that stuff has to be stored somewhere. And that last mile delivery, that same day delivery, it takes industrial warehouse space to be able to provide those goods to you. And then lastly, I think social spaces are going to be reimagined inside commercial buildings. Let's move on to grocery stores. So grocery store layouts, I think, are going to adapt. Right now, it's very common to have exposed produce sections. For those of you that have, like me, that have used Instacart and both the Kroger click list, it's great having not to go in the store. So you can imagine that Kroger and Publix and the big grocery store chains are really starting to think about, well, we don't have as many people in the store. How can we reallocate that space to be more efficient to accommodate these click and pull up, get your groceries, and go back home experiences that they provide. I can tell you in late March, I had a 4-day wait on a Publix Instacart order when we were kind of sequestering down in South Georgia for a couple of weeks, and just could not believe that it changed so quickly, but it did. Malls are a big topic right now. You've got, malls with big anchors are continuing to succumb to Amazon. Amazon's buying a lot of malls right now. I think other retail will be repurposed according to whatever locational advantages it has, whether it's, near an interstate or whether it's near a major population center. But I think you're going to continue to see a lot of changes in the retail sector. I think that movie theaters are going to take a hit. Online content offers very efficient distribution. The biggest, or one of the biggest impacts of that, I think, is what Disney is doing. Disney bought the rights to Hamilton recently, and instead of releasing that in movie theaters, they're going to release it, I believe, on Disney Plus, if I remember correctly. And that's going to happen. Maybe this summer. I forget the date. But anyway, online content is exploding right now. I'm sure some of you are taking advantage of that, and it's a sector to make sure you pay attention to. Last two things I want to cover on this slide: agents, brokers, multiple listing services, and prop tech firms, I think, are going to consolidate. So I think COVID has really been kind of an event that propels whatever was being done in terms of consolidation in that industry anyway. And then what that's going to do is it's people who have put cash aside, that's going to make some opportunities available for them to go in and participate, but also to buy distressed opportunities, things like distressed debt funds and non-performing loans. And then finally on this slide, drones, virtual real estate tours, and virtual sales, these have increased a lot. 10X, which owns auction.com, they constantly put out information about virtual sales and how they're getting buyers from all over the place, and how buyers are looking to put that dry powder that they've saved to work. In fact, I had an appraisal done of this building where I am right now about 2 weeks ago. Guy came out, he talked to me for 5 minutes, he put up a drone, took some aerial footage, and he was out of here in less than 15 minutes. So commercial appraisals are very quickly done these days. Very quickly, because I want to save plenty of time for questions, on the residential side, I think we're going to see some pressure release to the suburbs. I think you hear the term de-densification. I think you're going to see some of that, especially if people don't feel like they have to be in the office 5 days a week to do their jobs, and they can live, outside the perimeter or outside the more urban areas. I think home builders are going to be designing for multiple generations living in the same place. Home offices are going to continue to be a valued amenity, and I think you're going to see more personal gyms as well, as people maybe have a little bit of fear of going back to the gym. And but I can tell you, anecdotal evidence for people that have gone back to gyms, they've never been cleaner. So again, it's a tension that has to be resolved. Co-working may be the hottest new amenity in multifamily housing. I did due diligence on a deal up in Philadelphia a couple of weeks ago, and co-working space was actually shared between three different apartment buildings. A very innovative way of building co-working as a shared amenity into a space where that cost can be absorbed by 3 different projects. Just a quick word on vacant and abandoned properties. I think they're forming their own submarket, particularly in places that have been hit hard by COVID, and there may be a fear of going into a property that's occupied. Ken Johnson is a professor down in Florida. I think he's at Florida Atlantic, and he's got some data. He's collected some data on vacant and abandoned properties, and he's seen a little bit of an uptick in properties that are not occupied, in that they're better suited for virtual tours. People know going into it that they don't have to deal with people. They don't have to confront anybody, and so there are fewer concerns about viewing the property without having to deal with physical distancing. And then finally, as I alluded to earlier, schools, accommodate more distance learning options. Recently, the University System of California decided it was going to move online through the end of 2020. What nobody seems to be talking about, though, is what are the implications for real estate, especially in the small university towns where you don't have students. What's going to happen to the rental markets? I really haven't heard anybody talk about that. Last couple of slides here, and this again relates to residential real estate implications, but what's going on in terms of policies at the state level to curb evictions and keep families in their homes. We know that stability and keeping people in their homes and getting people through this transition period so they can get back to work is really important. So what I wanted to illustrate here, and again, I have not tested any of this or independently verified, but the Eviction Lab at Princeton University puts out a COVID policy scorecard, and I've got the link at the bottom of the slide. I put up one of the highest scoring states and one of the lowest scoring states. And you can see here that they have all kinds of different things that they're looking for from a policy perspective. And you can see that Georgia scores pretty low on this report. Now, I will tell you that it's a little out of date. It's about a month behind. The Massachusetts data is about 3 weeks behind. And it's something that I think it's something that policymakers and legislators really need to look at, figuring out a way to keep people in their homes so that they're not evicted, so that when they do get a job, they can just pick right back up. I almost think of it as like the forbearance equivalent for keeping people in their homes, as opposed to keeping a loan going and then tacking on missed principal and interest payments to the end of the period. So last couple of things to consider. What happens if schools don't reopen but businesses do? What does child care and education look like in a scenario like that, right? So think about that for a second. Schools don't reopen, but the businesses do. So now folks with kids have a place to go to work every day, but now they're still having to educate their child. What's the role of babysitters, and how do you make all that work? I mean, if one opens and the other doesn't, that's certainly something that's got to be considered. Another kind of thought-provoking question, can the fact that real estate is relatively illiquid, meaning that it can't be sold easily, can that illiquidity actually be a benefit in a pandemic? And I think the answer is yes. Having something that is illiquid means that you can't just make a gut decision to sell something that day and cash out. Illiquidity really forces you to look at your kind of entire portfolio if you're a business, or your entire set of investments if you're an individual and you're fortunate enough to have real estate as part of that individual wealth portfolio. So I think the fact that real estate is relatively illiquid is actually a benefit in a pandemic, because it really forces you to think about where you want to go next and form your strategy so that you can reallocate accordingly or make decisions that are good for you and your family. And then the last thing is, why is June 2020 the month to watch, in my opinion? Well, a lot of loans have a 60-day window to catch up if you ever get behind on loan payments. And so some loans, especially on the commercial side, have these different entities, a master servicer and a special servicer. Special servicers only get involved when the monetary conditions of the loan change. Well, June 30th is the end of the second quarter of this year. And at that time, pension and equity funds that own real estate have revaluations done. This has to do with financial accounting standards. And when that happens, we're going to know a lot more about quarterly distributions to owners of real estate funds, to REITs. We already know Calvin, a colleague of mine, Calvin Schnur at NAREIT, published something this morning that REITs have already taken a little bit of a hit. And by quarter two, I don't know if he expects more of a hit, but certainly that's something to keep our eyes on. And we got to really keep our eyes on whether funds start divesting those real estate assets. Where are those distressed debt funds going to come in, bring in a new operator, or reposition the asset to take it over and try to improve the asset? So this is my last slide. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. The take-home points that I would have for you is that we cannot predict consumer behavior as well as we think. There are often these tensions where you really have to think about which tension is stronger will determine which direction we go. The office space use is one that comes to mind. We usually operate with the rule that each employee requires about 150 square feet of space. It used to be 300 square feet, say 30 or 40 years ago. That continues to drop over time. But with that tension, coupled with the fact that more people want to work home, which of those different competing demands on the space is going to win out? So that's something to keep in mind. How we do economic development is probably going to change, and probably in ways that we didn't contemplate today. Real estate changes obviously are going to happen. Some asset classes are thriving, like self-storage, which I really didn't talk on a lot, but again, it's really going to come down to, once we get through this, what's the highest and best use of each individual property to either keep it in the same use or to reposition an asset to its highest and best use. I think work from home is going to be doable for about, estimates I've seen is about 1/3 of all jobs would be doable in the correct way to be completed from home. And so I think there's huge implications of that. Obviously, everybody's not going to work from home all the time, but you've got to figure out what that balance is for your business model and for your employees. And then finally, business owners may need to consider operational changes. You may have staggered in-office schedules. You may have overlapping work hours, whatever you need to do to ensure business continuity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you for giving such a comprehensive overview of the immediate but also longer-term impacts of COVID-19 on our broader market and economic development space. There are a number of questions on the chat box. Please do send us your questions on the chat box. I also know Daniela has questions, so let me just kick it off to Daniela to facilitate this conversation next.
Hey, thanks, Deborah. Hope you guys can hear me. Cliff, I know one thing that we talked about too was kind of the impact of rural communities across the state. I know that's a big importance too with the SMART program. So kind of how do you think that this is going to impact potentially rural migration out to those communities, and what are the potential positive impacts for rural communities from an economic development perspective? And then maybe could you talk about what infrastructure might be necessary to support a kind of move to the suburbs or rural communities across the state that may kind of benefit from that growth?
Yeah. So I definitely understand your question. So I'm going to take the second half of your question first. Rural communities really need access to the same quality of broadband that urban cities enjoy. That's a huge thing. There are other things that cause this kind of urban-rural divide in our state. A big one is hospitals. I know that small rural hospitals are closing. I've heard evidence of this back where I used to live in the Valdosta area and other places in the state too. But not having the same quality of broadband, rural hospitals closing is certainly a big thing. And some of it, too, I think, is a little bit of a perception that you can't have the same amenities in rural Georgia that you have in urban Georgia. And I think that just simply requires a shift in the way that you think about amenities, quite frankly. Having grown up basically, sitting in my grandfather's lap on his tractor, I know exactly what rural Georgia's like, but I also know what Atlanta's like. And it just really requires a shift in what you think you desire and what you think an amenity is. If you go to, I'm doing a project right now in Summerville, Georgia, up in Chattooga County. It's a U.S. Department of Agriculture grant, and we're trying to help provide small business technical assistance to businesses there. And the same amenities, for the most part, that you enjoy in Atlanta, you can find there. There aren't as many of them. They're not as dense, but you can find a lot of that there. It just simply requires a little bit of a shift in the way that you think about amenities and the way that you think about what it is that you need to enjoy life and to also complete your job competently. The first part of your question had to do with migration. And I don't think you're going to see a huge urban to rural shift, but I think you're going to see people who, if they feel like they don't have to be in the office 5 days a week, they might consider doing what I do. I commute an hour to Georgia Tech when I go in. I'm fortunate during the school year, I only have to go in 2 days a week. And the rest of the time, I live out on 28 acres, which is my little oasis here in Cartersville. And it's family land, so I've got a connection there. It's where I want to be. And but I get to enjoy the benefits of the city on my terms without having to live in the city. And so for the individual, it really comes down to the choice of where to work, the choice of where to live, how often I've got to commute between those two locations, and then what amenity package that I really want for me and my family. And that may be more rural or it may be more urban. But I can tell you, right here in Cartersville is a good example. I'm an hour to Atlanta, and basically what I can enjoy here, what I can enjoy Atlanta, I can enjoy here too. The only thing we don't have is a symphony.
Well, that's great, and I appreciate that. I think it's some great points. We've got some more questions kind of about local communities, and we've got one that asks about how deglobalization may impact local communities, and maybe thinking about those economies and what that could look like as we're kind of seeing these macro trends. If any kind of thoughts or maybe insights we could think about as we could look at kind of how this all evolves.
That's a big topic
Yep.
with a lot of moving parts. So let me say this: if we start to see a little bit of a reversal to globalization, what that's going to mean is that instead of offshoring, a very large percentage of jobs in a particular industry, we're going to make sure that there's a presence here for those jobs. And so, I alluded to earlier about, firms that have a large exposure to China with their supply chain. And what I think you'll see is that, maybe they'll still have a presence in China, but they'll have a backup that's onshore. I think what caught us a lot, and I've seen some media outlets do a little bit of coverage on this. What caught a lot of people off guard is that there wasn't a backup. 60 Minutes did a really nice piece a couple of weeks ago where they were talking about N95 masks and how we were caught a little off guard because we really didn't have much of an option here. There was one firm down in Texas, I believe it was, that could ramp up pretty quickly, but certainly couldn't meet the demand that we're facing. And that's really what we're talking about with masks. There's this just huge surge in demand for these types of things, and we did not have the capacity to meet that with the needed supply, or what we call the quantity supplied. And so what I think you're going to see is maybe not the reshoring of entire industries, but I think you're going to see people really contemplate, again, this probable versus possibilistic thinking, and that people are going to have backups that are onshore that can be mobilized quickly. So whereas right now you may have 90% of your supply chain coming from offshore, 10 onshore, that percentage may change to something like 70-30, right? But then that additional capacity would allow you to meet the supply that you would need in another pandemic situation should it occur. But thank you for the question.
No, and I think that was a great question from the chat box, and certainly businesses are going to kind of be evaluating these things. We have another question about, local tax bases and kind of what impact would any real estate, residential and commercial real estate have on those tax budgets for local communities, and kind of where do you see that all shaken out?
Well, I got my property tax bill yesterday, and it didn't make me very happy. So I've already appealed. So I'll start there. This hits home for me. Tax assessors do great work. I understand what they do. I understand how they do it. There's a couple of different ways to handle the property tax revenue portion of what comes into accounting. One is you increase the assessed value of each property, or you can hold the assessed value steady and you can change the millage rate. That often happens between the time you get a property tax bill and when your property taxes come due in the fall. At least that's the way it works in this state. So I got my tax bill yesterday, or my proposed tax bill. It won't be due until probably November or December here in Bartow County. But in the meantime, there can be changes to the millage rate, although they're usually minor, to make up any revenue differences. So those are two things that tax assessors tend to use to alter how much revenue comes into the county. If you and this gets real tricky fast. If real estate appraisers start to come in and give, let's say, a COVID-19 discount, that has all kinds of implications, not the least of which affects loan-to-value ratios as you attempt to pay for these things. But then if there's a huge discrepancy between what the county is telling you your property is worth, but you have an appraisal that tells you it's, let's say, much less, then you've got an argument for a property tax appeal. So then you take that appraisal, you take it over here to the county courthouse, you attach it to the one-page property tax appeal form. I did this yesterday, so I know exactly how this works. And then they open a file on you and you start to review. And so I think there could be some interesting implications if, people are having appraisals done for like refinances and things like that, and there's a huge discrepancy between that value and what you're seeing over here on the county records from the tax assessor's office. There's going to be a lot of jockeying back and forth as to, hey, meet me in the middle, or, take this appraisal as given, and that should be the market value. And so that's also going to affect the level of property tax revenue that would come into counties.
Thanks, Cliff. And I have one question that's kind of related on that. Someone asked, what would you recommend regarding refinancing for current homeowners and residential real estate?
Well, I just did this. I have really good personal experience with this. So this is just me talking. This is, not the view of anybody else. A good time to refinance for me is when you see the interest rate differential be at least 1.5 points. So I'll give you a real life example. This building I'm standing in right now, I had an interest rate of something like 5.4%, and I just got it down to 4%. And so I did that. I did some tweaks with the amortization, and I was able to get my monthly payments down by $250 a month. That's a big deal. And even with the cost of origination and changing that mortgage, changing the terms, I'm still able to save money in the long run in a relatively short time period, 12 to 14 months. And so the bigger the spread that you can see between what you're paying currently for an interest rate and what let's call that the source interest rate, and then your destination interest rate, if you can get at least 1.5 points spread between those, preferably 2, you're going to make up that differential pretty quickly. And banks love the fact they can originate some points. If you have a relationship with a banker, they'll usually keep that down to a minimal amount because they want to keep your business, and quite frankly, they want to keep you from going to a mortgage broker where that mortgage broker is going to shop dozens of different mortgage options to try to give you the best rate and the best term. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks for the chat for that. Deborah, I only have a minute or so left, and I wanted to see what your thoughts were on timing.
So thanks to Daniela. This is Greg again.
Hey, Greg.
I'm gonna wrap it up, and I think we're pretty much out of time. So I just want to thank both of you very much, Cliff and Daniela. Cliff, for the great presentation, very, very informative. We had over 90 attendees today, so obviously this presentation really hit home. People are concerned about the real estate and the general economy in this incredible time that we're in. So thank you so much for that, and thank you, Daniela, for moderating and for the questions. I'd like to remind everyone that we do have 5 more of these Thursday at noon webinars as part of our Smarter Together series coming up. So our last one in May, on May 28th, is Enabling Together Smarter Pandemic Supply Chain Readiness and Response. And then we have 4 newly solicited presentations for June as well, and those are on topics that vary from democratizing connectivity, the digital divide, cybersecurity, and community action. So again, Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you for everyone attending. And we hope you decide to continue attending our Smarter Together webinars in the future.